In September 22, as we all know, a series of massive underwater explosions destroyed sections of the two Nord Stream pipelines built to transport natural gas from Russia to Europe via Germany. So beyond the clear disinformation and dissembling on all sides, who really did it? Holger Stark, one of the leading lights of German investigative journalism and someone who's on the editorial board of Die Zeit, is here to tell us, or at least give us his best view. Holger, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and a pleasure being here. If you guys, yeah, thank you very much. So what I want to talk about is the anatomy of a cross-border investigation, because this is a cross-border crime, so we very, very soon realized that this is nothing that one newsroom nationally would be capable of investigating and solving. So James mentioned already what happened on September 26, 2022. There were several explosions which took out 3 out of 4 pipelines. So not every pipeline was destroyed, but 3 out of 4 were destroyed. It rattled the Baltic Sea, but the incident took place in international waters, so no country was directly harmed, which is important because it would have been seen as a direct attack. The attack ended one of the most controversial projects in politics. As James said, Nord Stream was used to bypass Ukraine. It established a bilateral relationship in the economy between Russia and Germany, and it has been seen and perceived by many people as a pretext to the invasion of Ukraine. So it was very clear from day one on that this is something that is not only like an infrastructure thing, but a highly politicized question. The main countries which were harmed were obviously Russia, which was in possession and owned the pipeline, but also Russia. And on the other hand, you had Ukraine, Poland, and the United States as the main benefiters. Ukraine, as said, because they always felt that this is like a betrayal. The Poles, because they had the impression the Germans would do their bilateral thing, and the United States for geopolitical reasons. You remember there were a lot of sanctions and a lot of pressure against the German government imposed by the US government. So here is a map that you can see where took place what. The flashing lights are the places of the attack itself. And remember the blue dots, I'll get back to that later. So the question is, how do you investigate a transnational political crime? A political crime where the main actors are governments, armed forces, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement. A crime where it is very hard to find witnesses because the only thing you see is a rattled Baltic Sea, and there is no real opportunity to get to the scene of the crime, investigate it, to speak to people who are living nearby, ask them, and ask around. And especially in a political situation where there's almost little to almost non-interest having in transparent investigation, because it was clear that no country would be interested in disclosing things, especially not the German government, but coming to that a little bit later. And this is one of the stories where you don't have a leak. I mean, you had 3 leaks at the pipeline, but you had no classic leak with documents or whistleblowers coming forward. It was about sources, 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 which is one of the slogans of this symposium as well. So there were 3 main theories floating around. Theory 1, it was Russia. Theory 2, it was the CIA. And the third theory, it was Ukraine. In the first place, the Russian theory was a predominant one. And honestly, I must admit, I followed that theory as well. Given how brutal and how I would say unleashed Russian intelligence acted in Europe over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. Remember Skripal, remember the murder of a Georgian guy in Berlin and other kind of sabotage acts. So it seemed to be plausible that it was Russia. It was only 3 out of 4 pipelines, so you could make the argument that there was one pipeline remaining intact, so the flow of gas could be restored. That all made kind of sense. So I started my investigation following the Russian lead. And there were a lot of reports, not only during that time, but up until today, that Russia somehow has been involved. There was a Swedish-Danish TV documentary following some Russian ship movements in the Baltic Sea, which showed some correlation to the places where the explosion took place. There was a German TV, RTL, and a website, T-Online, which said there is undisputable evidence that Russia was involved, kind of phrasing that I never would use in such a situation with such a floating scenery. But it came up with a strong support in the public media. And then there was a famous report, I would even say infamous, by an American journalist who is a legend, Seymour Hersh, someone I know well, who came up in February 2023 with a theory that it was the CIA. It was a remarkable piece. It wasn't published by any bigger outlet, but on Substack, on CIJ's own platform. And he admitted that he only had one source, which is already in itself an interesting constellation for such a delicate topic. And he also claimed that this source wasn't directly involved, but only had some kind of like hearsay about it. Nevertheless, he claimed it was a commando of CIA and military divers from the United States, with Norway providing logistical assistance. And it was taken out for hegemonial geopolitical reasons without the knowledge of other guys. Our theory was it wasn't Russia and it wasn't the CIA, but it was Ukraine. How did the investigation start? In the weeks after the incident, I met one of my sources, a long-standing contact, and I came up with the assumption that it was Russia and asked, well, yeah, it looks like Russia is behind it. Don't you think so? It would be kind of plausible. So we chatted a little bit back and forth, and then you have sometimes this view in the eye of a source you're talking to. It wasn't exactly what he said. It was more like how he looked. And then I said, like, is there something that I should know? And he said, like, well, there's this one contradictory report that pinpoints in another direction. And I said, like, what? Like, and he said, like, I can't disclose it. It's classified, top secret. And then I said, like, oh, it's Ukraine, maybe. And then he just nodded and said he can't continue speaking. So it was the one source. It was just a tiny bit of information, impossible to publish, and I didn't find a second source. But my colleague Georg Heil from German Public TV, ARD, from the magazine Contraste, he found another source, and that source provided an even more detailed account with a sailing ship called Andromeda and a small Ukrainian crew behind it, and that there was a German ongoing criminal law enforcement investigation. So from that starting point onwards, we started to dig deeper into acquired additional sources. And on March 7th, we came up with the breaking news that it could be Ukraine being behind it. Look at the wording, we were kind of careful. We said just traces lead to Ukraine. So we didn't claim that Ukraine did it. There was also always the question who was politically responsible for it. So we just said it points towards Ukraine. The story went around the world, made headlines. We gave a lot of interviews. There were many follow-ups by almost all kinds of outlets globally. And we almost immediately faced a backlash that I haven't experienced in an investigation that I would perceive as a factual thing and not a hit piece driven by ideology or something. So Cy Hersh, whom I know since a long time, came up with a second piece and immediately claimed that the CIA planted a false cover story, see it above, and also said that the CIA found willing takers in the New York Times, which did a piece as well, in 2 major German publications, by creating a story of deep-sea divers and a crew who did not exist. Again, I always would be in such a difficult environment, be careful with my wording. Sai wasn't. So we met I called him and said, like, Sai, we have to talk. And we met on his porch and discussed the thing. And it became immediately clear that he didn't have much substance, not many facts. So we chatted a bit back and forth. And the next day, he came up with another piece. We said this was like an off-the-record conversation. And in that piece, he quoted me. So I thought, like, okay, if this is like the methodology he's working with, that's interesting. And he even quoted me with sentences I never said. So there was like this public backlash, and it wasn't only like factually driven, but it became very very soonish, very personal. So this is a piece from a newspaper in Berlin, a German newspaper, and the story started with me saying I'm one of the most experienced journalists of the country, but how can I publish such a bullshit story? So we realized, maybe we were a bit naive when we published it in the first place. We realized very soon that this is like a hugely politicized story. And we also were kind of surprised because Ukraine denied it immediately. That's not very, very much surprising. But Russia denied it as well, because the Russians always followed the theory that it was the CIA. That's why they promoted CIJ's story. And this is a statement that just came out a couple of days ago, in November 11th of this year, where Nikolai Patrushev from the Russian government still claims this only could have been conducted by NATO divers and re-emphasizes the CIA theory. So we had the interesting constellation that there's an ongoing war, and the pipeline was destroyed as a obviously part of that ongoing war. But both war parties denied our reporting. So what did the German government do? How did the German government reacted? They decided not to comment at all and said, like, we're not commenting any kind of ongoing investigation. Instead, they opened up another investigation. The Chancellery installed a task force, and that task force was solely tasked to find out who our sources were. So they pulled up different documents from the intelligence world and law enforcement. They compared phrasing, sentences, how what appeared in our reporting, and if some internal documents included a specific fact. They set up a timeline, who knew what at what time. They reduced the circle of people who were involved in that investigation to just a small number of people. I found it, again, quite astonishing, but it became obvious that the German government had no political interest in disclosing such a delicate thing, especially not with a country like Ukraine, which receives support by the German government. After the United States, we're the second biggest arms supplier for the Ukrainian army. So there are 2 kinds of truth. There is a forensic truth. This forensic truth has to be investigated in Germany, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Poland, and the Netherlands. It's just what happened, when, and where. And then there is the political truth, and this is obviously playing in Ukraine itself. The question, who ordered it, with which political intention. So therefore, because we soon realized that this is like an international thing, an operation which went through several countries and is way more than just a German thing, we decided to join forces with colleagues. In the first place, we were 4 reporters, German Public TV and Die Zeit. Then our friends, colleagues, and competitors from Süddeutsche Zeitung and another branch of the German Public TV came up with own reporting, and they disclosed additional aspects which emphasized our reporting, but shed new light on new details. So we called them, they called us, and we decided to join forces in an extraordinary move. Usually we compete against each other, but in this case we said, like, it's such a hard investigation with so many people who just don't want it to be out, that it's better to join forces. And then we decided, because it's a transnational thing, that we enlarge our group and include it to Express in a Swedish paper, to a Danish paper, to NOS from the Netherlands, to a French outlet and a Polish outlet as well. And we coordinated, we shared all kinds of research except sources, and it became an unusual, transparent, and an unusual, friendly and collegial cooperation, which has been not driven by a leak, so you can look over those data things. But in this case, we really trusted each other that the report that our sources brought back would be in trusted hands. So the core of the investigation is there was one sailing boat, a yacht, which was rented. 6 Ukrainian people were on board, 4 divers, 2 sailors. They had 4 or 5 bombs, still unclear, and the commando started in Germany. This is the boat we're speaking about. It's called Andromeda. It's a Bavarian 46 feet boat, and it was searched in January 23 by German authorities. They retrieved traces of explosives. They found some DMA leftovers, some damages on the boat. And they were able, because after they found the boat, to retrieve the route that the boat took. So again, you saw that chart already. The blue dots were confirmed points where the Andromeda definitely between September 6th and September 23rd made a stopover. So that, at least for us, was a starting point. So we started research in the field. We tried to find eyewitnesses via OSINT. We compared postings by sailors with the dates of the Andromeda. We met a couple of people who were sailing during the time in Germany, in Sweden, in Poland, in the UK. And we finally found 2 sailors who said they were next to the Andromeda. They gave us a description of the crew. This is how our illustrator imagined those descriptions. He described that they looked very much military style. They were well trained. They spoke with accent. They were not really friendly, and they had one of them had even a Ukrainian signet. And then we obtained documents of the company who rented that boat. It was obviously a shell company, but it led to Poland. And the guy who was the owner of that company turned out to be a Ukrainian businessman who lived in Kiev. So we made a first field trip to Kiev and found out the address where the guy was living and basically confronted him. That's him when he comes back from a Saturday noon shopping center tour with a small kid. And we crashed him with a camera and approached him. And at the beginning he was laughing, then he was complaining. He disappeared in a place of the gated community, and he called on later, a little bit later, like 2 hours or so later, and started to threat our reporters with like death threats. People would come after us, but he refused to talk about more details. So we conducted a second field trip, in this case to Kiev, and this is a guy on the left here who allegedly coordinated parts of the commando. It was a revelation done by colleagues from Washington Post and Der Spiegel, so it wasn't our reporting to name him, but he agreed to sit down with us, and we spoke for some 7 hours. He is under house arrest for a different story. He is a former guy who used to serve in the intelligence services of Ukraine. And he didn't speak explicitly about Nord Stream, I think for legal reasons, but he came as close as he could and discussed with us the geopolitical landscape and provided some more aspects which were really interesting. So earlier this year, we learned that the German investigation proceeded, and they had been able to identify a couple of people. And in one case, they even issued an arrest warrant. We learned that early on, and the question was how to deal with that, because the Germans issued the arrest warrant and shared it with the Poles, because that guy, the Ukrainian diver, used to live in Poland at the time. On one hand, you think this is something of public interest and you need to push a ball and keep the publication ongoing. On the other hand, there was a real chance to arrest the guy, and if we would have reported about that, he probably would just flee. So the question was what to do. So we sent a team of reporters. On the left is a colleague of mine, on the right a colleague of German public TV, to Warsaw, but decided not to knock on his door, but to look around, to visit the company he's working with, and just to check in what kind of neighborhood he's living, but we didn't approach him. Then we heard from the investigators that the guy disappeared, and that was a moment we decided to run the story. So we published it in August of this year, simultaneously with the national coalition of media, but also internationally. And this is the guy I'm speaking about. He was a former military guy. He and his friends. He's from a diving school in Kiev. They collected money and weapons supply for the Ukrainian army. They were like gluing patriots. All stuff that we learned online. They were especially trained in deep sea diving, technical diving. So they had the skills to operate in a depth of 80 to 90 meters, where the pipelines were. The arrest warrant was issued in June, but Poland obstructed the German investigation. The guy left Poland in the first days of July, after the Poles realized what that was what the arrest warrant would mean. Remember, Poland, one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine. There was basically no interest politically to arrest such a guy. It would have caused political uproar in Poland. The diver left Ukraine in a Ukrainian diplomatic car, I think on July 7th, and went back to Ukraine. Fun fact is, one of the reasons why the German investigators were so convinced that he was part of the crew is he was caught by a speed camera when he approached the yacht. So in the proximity of the sailing boat, they drove too fast. A speed camera caught them, so he could be identified on that picture. German investigators later interrogated the driver, who was from a commercial service. He also confirmed the identity. Then the DNA traces and others came all together. So that's why they are quite convinced, and it was enough for an arrest warrant. In the meantime, other divers were identified around that diving school. One is that guy, Evgen Uspensky. So there is some kind of understanding how the commando looked like. So the big question is, 2 years after that investigation, where do we stand? Where does the investigation stand? Denmark and Sweden, which opened investigations as well because the attacks took place close to their shoreline, they closed their investigations. For a long time, they said they would come up with public statements whenever the investigation is in a more advanced stage. When they realized the Germans had to investigate it in a more sincere and in-depth way, they realized it's a great escape route for them. So they, one after another, decided to close their investigation, and then they submitted all their evidence to the Germans and said, like, good luck, have fun with that. So the German investigation is the only one which is still ongoing, and I would say it's safe to say that the plot has been uncovered in significant parts, but the political background and the political outfall has not. So the question, who's behind, who ordered it, how high up in the chain did it go, and is there some knowledge of Western allies of Ukraine, that's still to be investigated. I'm still not sure if the German government ever would have come up publicly with the investigation. Until we wrote about it, it was totally sealed. Our publication made it impossible to pursue that route. I would say this is a classical situation where journalism served as some kind of like public watchdog. We just closed the escape opportunity to close it and say this investigation led nowhere, so we are not going to pursue it any longer. And on the other hand, it's also very much clear this one has to be continued. We're not yet done. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions. We have a roving mic.
Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. You were approached by somebody, or you talked to somebody who then gave you this snippet of it might be Ukraine. How do you know this person isn't sent to you, and how do you check the partners you worked with? I'm asking because you mentioned the NOS in the Netherlands, which is where I'm from. And the NOS in the Netherlands is all but reliable. Our media is very much a hostage of two media companies, and it is currently overseen by the founder of our equivalent of the what do you call it, the Homeland Security Department. So, I mean, the media in Holland is really not independent. So if that's a partner, then I don't know if that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, or the two questions. Well, you develop over time a sense of who your sources are and to whom you speak. And in this case, I knew the person for really a long time, and the person provided information in the past that always turned out to be reliable. So you just have some kind of experience to whom you're talking. And even more credible was that I didn't talk to the person in the first place to speak about Nord Stream, but we discussed other topics. So Nord Stream was more like an annex, or a topic that we also mentioned at the end. And it was very clear that person had no interest at all to go deeper into the details. It was more like slipped his tongue, and as I said, you just saw it. I could see in his eyes that there are some like big question marks, and the person definitely didn't want to go further. So that alone gave me a lot of the sense that there is something significant. But as I said, that alone wasn't enough. So we only proceeded after Georg Heil from Kontraste had an independent own source with which provided even more details. So having two sources is a classical moment where you just say, now it's credible. And the NOS colleagues, in this scenario, there is Dutch involvement because the Dutch military intelligence learned through a source that there was an Ukrainian commando underway. And they shared these intelligence hints with the Americans, but also with the Germans. So there was a need from our side to have a Dutch partner. And somehow there was an established connection, which didn't go through me in that case, but with a trusted colleague from NOS. So after we had this established contact, we needed a reliable Dutch partner to approach Dutch intelligence and Dutch sources to verify that part of the story. This is something that even with the best contacts in your home country, you are usually not capable of providing or bringing to the table. If something happens in another country, there's no way you establish that kind of relationship to Dutch intelligence or Swedish intelligence or so. So we were just relying on that. And in this case, it turned out to be okay.
Okay, another question. Maybe this woman here? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm a reporter in Hong Kong. It's interesting you're talking about Ukrainian divers, because in the story that I have investigated more than 10 years ago, the loss of MH370, there are 2 Ukrainian divers on the plane. And actually that made me do some research at the time on Ukrainians and Ukrainians divers. And what I found out at the time is that Ukrainians really had a name for dirty work. And they're probably trained. I didn't go very deep into, looking how they're trained and what they do. But people in different trades around the world told me, you need people to do mercenary, basically kind of nasty task. You find you're Ukrainian. So the fact that there may be Ukrainians involved in this operation, to me, does not necessarily lead to Ukraine as, the power, the government behind it. And the other question, which I find is very important, and I'm not sure you completely covered it in there, is when there is such a thing, such a massive, absolutely scandalous, outrageous event, who really benefits from it? And in this case, my impression is that business-wise, because it's always money behind all these kind of things somehow, just like we heard with Bolivia, it was lithium, etc. What happened with Nord Stream is that in a matter of days or months, Europe suddenly had to import its energy from the US at a much higher price. So is the real benefactor Ukraine, or is the real benefactor the US? And just one final point.
Oh, we need to. I think that's probably enough for us.
Okay.
We only have 3 minutes left.
But the conference...
Let me
Okay.
answer your last point. Nord Stream wasn't operational any longer at the time when it was sabotaged because Putin played already a power game in the weeks beforehand and stopped delivering gas. So the Germans had anyway at the time already begun to diversify their energy supply, and they mainly did not buy American gas, but they went to Qatar and asked the Qataris to provide liquid gas, and also Norway filled in significant parts of that. So if you ask about benefiters economically, it would be more Qatar, and it would be also more Norway. And regarding the question who's politically motivated, as I said, it's still up for a final answer, but there are strong indicators that at least at that time the head of the Ukrainian army, General Zaluzhny, was involved. There are some credible hints for that. A guy, by the way, who is just a couple of miles away from this place here, because he has been sent to the UK as a Ukrainian ambassador. I think the more relevant question is, did Zaluzhny share it? Did he share it with President Zelensky, or was it something that was kept within the Ukrainian army?
Okay, I think one last question, which has to be super concise and in the form of a single question. Who would like to? What do you think, Marina? This gentleman?
What was the timeline of different governments knowing or having suspicions that potentially the Ukrainians were involved in this, do you think?
Yeah, great question. Interestingly, the first Dutch hint came already in June 23, so like 4 months beforehand, that there was such a plan. Then the CIA, the Dutch shared it with the CIA. The CIA approached the Ukrainians and warned them and said, like, don't do it. And allegedly thought it was called off, but the Ukrainians didn't call it off. Then it happened. The Germans found the Andromeda, the yacht, in January, so 4 months afterwards, our publication came in March.
I think we should leave it there. Even though the Ukrainian government doesn't want to know anything about this, when I talk to my Ukrainian friends, they seem almost proud of the technical sophistication and ingenuity of this, if it was their side, which is probably one reason, I think, why the Russians are so adamant that it couldn't have been the Ukrainians. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Holger Stark, for such an illuminating, gripping discussion. Thank you.